All right, well, welcome and thank you for joining us for our Fall 2021 Virtual Visiting Scholar webinar series. I am Virginia Rhodes, Project Director for the ARC Network, and we're very excited today to host Dr. Ramon Barthelemy from the third Virtual Visiting Scholars cohort for today's webinar. The Virtual Visiting Scholars program empowers scholars to complete metasynthesis and meta-analysis of existing literature to address critical issues relevant to equity and STEM. Now, before we introduce today's wonderful speaker, I would like to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, I want to let you know this webinar is being recorded and we will make those recordings available on our website and social media. Today, we will be using Zoom's integrated live captioning as well. To walk you through some of the functions, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options, including live transcript. Clicking on the caret will reveal options to show or hide the subtitles, and you can also view or hide the full transcript. Also hovering over the bottom of your Zoom window will reveal options for Q&A and chat located in the center. For the beginning of our webinar, you'll only be able to view chat messages from the ARC team, and we will share links to resources and our feedback survey in there. Now, we will open the chat for attendees at the start of the Q&A portion. So if you have any questions for the speakers, please add them to the Q&A, and you can also upvote questions that resonate with you. Now, WePan's Director of Research and Constituent Relations and ARC Network's PI, Heather Metcalf, will briefly share more about the ARC Network.
Thank you, Virginia. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholar program, and online events like this one. The ARC Network is built on and works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. We strive to ensure that our work accounts for the social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that folks experience. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advanced Program, and the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WEPAN, serves as our home organization. You can find ARC on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at ARC Equity in STEM and #Equity in STEM. And we are excited to launch our new website where you can learn more about the ARC Network and our team, events, and programs. Visit equityinstem.org to see the new site. To introduce our speaker is Stephanie Page, ARC Network's Community Engagement Manager.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We are so excited to host another project presentation for Cohort 3 of the Virtual Visiting Scholars Program. Just a quick reminder again that if you have any questions for our speaker, please add them to the Q&A and upvote the ones that resonate with you. And again, we will also open up the chat once we begin our Q&A section. As I said, joining us today is Dr. Ramon Barthelemy. Dr. Barthelemy is currently an assistant professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Dr. Barthelemy's current research applies qualitative and quantitative methods to study workforce preparation of underserved student populations and the impact of student perceptions of diversity and inclusion on final course grades and learning outcomes. During his tenure as a Fulbright Fellow, his work in Finland included researching physics education and teaching collegiate courses on international education and equity in science. As a AAAS Science Policy Fellow, Dr. Barthelemy's assignment with the U.S. Department of Education included work on national STEM education equity, where he also wrote national policy on the matter. Dr. Barthelemy's extensive publication portfolio includes the focuses on experiences of women in graduate physics and astronomy and LGBT+ persistence in the field of physics. Dr. Barthelemy earned his BS in astrophysics from Michigan State University and his MA and PhD in physics education research from Western Michigan University. Thank you for joining us, Ramon. Let's switch over screen sharing so you can get started.
Awesome. Thank you for the nice introduction. And let me share my screen, see if that works out. So hopefully everybody can see that. So thank you again to Stephanie, Heather, Ursula, Virginia and all the wonderful people at WePan and the ARC Network for first accepting my fellowship application and also giving me the opportunity to speak with you all. So I'm excited to talk with you today. And if you'd like to connect with me, I just started using Twitter again. I took a 4-year break, and you can all imagine why I took a 4-year break, but I'm back on Twitter, so feel free to interact with me there, and also on LinkedIn. I like to start every one of my talks talking about the wonderful folks that work in my research group here at the University of Utah. We're a unique group focusing on the physics culture and also policies, and I always like to just give a quick thanks to them. So for my talk today, there's really 2 big parts of the talk, which is looking at queer history in the United States from Stonewall to today, and then also looking at the big key findings from the report that I wrote up for this fellowship, looking at queer research in STEM education. And also I will end with some ideas for what we can do in our classrooms and our own research moving forward. I also like to start out by doing a land acknowledgement, because I am here at the University of Utah on the traditional lands of many groups, including the Utes. I also like to point people to resources. There's an amazing paper that my colleagues wrote called Indigenous People Exist Within Physics. So I think that's a wonderful article to check out and learn about Indigenous people's work in the field of physics. I think when talking about queerness and LGBT people, it's also important to mention that a lot of Indigenous groups had cultures and societies that allowed gender and sexual orientation to be defined very differently than how we see it now, and really how the colonial Western Europe perceived and saw gender and sexuality and really forced upon the people in the colonization process. So it's important to recognize that there's groups like the Two-Spirited in the Navajo Nation and the Muche, which now live in what is modern day Mexico, and understanding that gender variance and sexual orientation, quote unquote, variance has existed for many, many years. And unfortunately, colonialism is one of the reasons why we don't see the diversity that we should see in gender and sexual orientation across the world. The first Pride was a riot. Queer rights have been hard won on the struggles, abuse, and bloodshed of countless queer people across time and the world. This talk, however, will focus on queer civil rights generally in the USA, with an eye towards developments and conditions that exist today in STEM education by looking at the literature that has propagated in about the last 20 years on this topic. Throughout this talk, I will use the word queer and LGBT to reference the cumulative community of people from all races, classes, and ethnicities that identify their genders and sexuality outside the norms given to us by society. How we talk about and address queer people over time has changed, but for this talk, I will primarily rely on contemporary language and also make references when we are seeing older language that might be considered out of step now. This is not to say that queer people, out or not, did not exist before the Stonewall Uprising and contributed to furthering queer civil rights. Many did, some finding acclaim and others finding ruin for the simple audacity to be themselves. Performers such as Gladys Bentley entertained across the United States while bending gender both in their attire and performance, so much so that her Broadway show prompted police protests as they barred attendees from her grand show, which launched one of her first across-the-nation performances. Author James Baldwin famously left the United States for Paris when he wrote about the Black experience in America, as well as crafting some of the first novels about queer experience. He also later went on to be a counselor for Robert F. Kennedy on the experience of Black Americans. Queer women like Jane Addams led the charge on women's suffrage, advocating for women's right to vote and other equal rights. Of course, the cause should be delicately discussed here because it oftentimes excluded women of color. And of course, there's the now and deservedly so famous Alan Turing, who was a physicist and computer scientist that helped crack the Enigma code that helped end World War II, but died by suicide after being chemically castrated when the British government discovered his same-sex relationships. The pre-Stonewall era is not home just to a few anecdotal queers, but also organizations and activism to fight government policies and firing queer people and fighting an increasing bevy of laws being enforced on queer communities and people. Two such organizations were the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis, who represented and advocated for gay men and lesbian women respectively. One such early organizer of the Mattachine Society was PhD astronomer Frank Kameni, who was fired from being an astronomer for the US Army Map Service when his gay identity was discovered. This spurred Dr. Kameni into activism, where he wrote an equality bill in 1963 that took 30 years to pass and launched some of the earliest queer picketing of the White House in 1965. He died in 2011, but was lucky enough in the early 2000s to be able to stand by then President Barack Obama's side as he signed an executive order which barred discrimination against LGBT people in federal employment. Dr. Kameni also stood in stark contrast to many of his contemporaries as he advocated that queer people and non-queer people were equals. He propagated and popularized the phrase, "gay is good." Even understanding this history in earlier protests, such as the Compton Cafeteria Uprising in San Francisco, Stonewall stands as the historic marker in the US for the galvanization of queer rights. All the details of the evening are contested, but what is known is that one night, police began to raid the Stonewall Inn to arrest queer people by doing clothing checks, so ensuring that people had on at least 3 pieces of clothing that correlated with their gender, or looking for anything they deemed as homosexual behavior. These kinds of raids were routine, but the patrons of the Stonewall Inn were a queer community who had been targeted the most, and in many ways they had little to lose due to what had already been taken from them. These were queer youth who lived on the streets after being kicked out of their homes, drag performers, trans people, and many were also people of color. It was this evening where they fought back against the police by throwing bricks, lighter fluid, and coins. The coins themselves represented the bribes that police normally took to turn away from these sorts of raids, but didn't this evening. As one participant in the riot said, "The police felt menaced for the first time. They were afraid of us instead of our being afraid of them." One later attending to the riots much later in the night proclaimed, "I want my gay rights now," being the activist, trans woman of color, and icon Marsha P. Johnson. The uprising and riots at Stonewall led to the first gay pride in the 1970s. The gay rights movement at first was a truly inclusive space through the Gay Liberation Front, but slowly began to focus on the needs of upper class individuals, primarily white, who didn't bend gender and wore clothes deemed appropriate for their societally ascribed genders. So much so that a few years later at a rally, I believe on Christopher Street, but that detail I'll need to double check, another trans icon, Sylvia Rivera, was barred from the stage from giving testimony to her experiences and speaking about the liberatory activities that she was participating in. However, she pushed her way on stage and proclaimed, "I have been beaten. I have had my nose broken. I have been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment for my gay liberation. And this is how you treat me?" Exclusion of transgender people from the growing movement was not alone. The movement also began to focus on the issues most pertinent to the white queer community. This prompted organization around the specific needs of the trans community and specifically people of color within the larger queer umbrella. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson went on to form STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. Of course, transvestite is not a word that we would use today, but it was a word that was used at the time. This incredibly important, albeit short-lived STAR House went beyond just simple activism, and it also sought to give food and shelter to queer trans youth, primarily youth of color, which was an important step in how we consider and think about queer activism because there was really a boots on the ground component of it, of supporting people in their day-to-day lives. This exclusion, however, was not limited just to trans people and trans people of color from the larger gay and lesbian rights movement. Lesbian women and trans women were often excluded, and aggressively so, from the women's rights movement at the time. And LGBT people in general were excluded from the larger civil rights movement in full motion at this time as well. And unfortunately, the burden to educate the majority fell on the shoulders of people of color, queer people, and women. And this also spurred on activism from people that had intersectional identities, such as poet Audre Lorde. Black and people of color are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. Women are expected to educate men. Lesbians and gay men are expected to educate the heterosexual world. The oppressors maintain their position and evade their responsibility for their own actions. And really, when Audre Lorde, a Black feminist lesbian activist, spoke out against these issues and talked about her own identity, it really began to bring up early conversations of what would eventually be known as intersectionality. And it wasn't just individuals like Audre Lorde that were speaking out, but also collectives. So this prompted further counterspaces to be formed, such as the Kameni River Collective in 1974, which was a Black lesbian socialist organization fighting for their equal rights. And we see as our particular task the development of integrated analyses and practice upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. At the same time as these many diverse and influential coalitions were building, strong opposition to queer civil rights were also mounting, led by people like Anita Bryant and Phyllis Schlafly. They sought to overturn newly established anti-discrimination bills in places like Florida, California, and Michigan, while also attempting to make it so openly queer people could not become teachers. Their successes were mixed, but fortunately now largely overturned and obscured by productive activism. Anita Bryant was famously pied by activists for her blatant bigotry against the queer community. And just this summer, it was said that she took another pie to their face because it turns out her granddaughter was gay and her granddaughter was deciding whether or not to invite her to her wedding. The struggle for queer civil rights became a literal fight for our lives in the early 80s with the growing HIV epidemic. By 1981, the HIV epidemic was correlated with gay men, but it was not publicly discussed by then President Reagan until 1985. And sadly, it was met by jubilation by the Catholic Church and other religious organizations as it was seen as a punishment towards us. And it was also a step back for all the rights that we had gained through the 60s and 70s on the backs of important organizers such as Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, Harvey Milk, and others. By 1985, tens of thousands of people had died in the USA alone. And this, of course, was the year when Reagan finally acknowledged that the epidemic was happening. Advocacy groups began to form at this time to demand attention and support of this epidemic, including groups such as Babashi, Blacks Educating Blacks About Sexual Health, as well as the group Black and White Men Together that was formed in Chicago. By Reagan's public address in 1985, though, as I mentioned, tens of thousands of people had already died. I'd also like to mention that some of the earliest groups that focused on HIV and stopping the then epidemic were intersectional and really were unifying, bringing people together. The larger, albeit less inclusive, group ACT UP formed in 1987 and held impactful protests across the country, advocating for more research as well as for more acknowledgement of the pandemic. Many of these included die-ins where queer people and their allies would lie dead in the streets, churches, and in front of offices in order to bring attention to the epidemic. Along with these protests were demands around better research and access to experimental drugs for dying patients of the disease. This well-orchestrated activism pushed public acknowledgement of HIV/AIDS by the government and further medical research. And it's interesting to note that the two lead doctors during this pandemic in the United States were Drs. Fauci and Birx. By 1996, effective treatments were found for the disease and AIDS-related deaths began to decline precipitously, as you can see here in this figure. This brings us into the 90s, which was an even more complicated era for queer civil rights. Early indications by President Clinton suggested he would be an ally for queer rights. He absolutely was not. By 1996, the military confirmed its ban and also implemented the Defense of Marriage Act, all under the purview of then President Clinton. By 1998, Coretta Scott King voiced his support for queer rights, the widow of the former Dr. Martin Luther King. By 2003, sodomy laws were finally ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And the 2000s up to 2020 saw a back and forth of gay marriage or same-sex marriage being banned, finally being legalized. We see the lifting of the queer ban in the military. And we also see it finally being made illegal to discriminate against queer people in the workplace. However, all is not rosy. This progress is not without backlash, and a new Supreme Court is poised to dismantle further and existing queer rights. So far in 2021, there have been more than 250 anti-LGBT bills introduced in state legislatures, which is the greatest number of any individual year. Although much has been won, rights are a fragile thing, and the negative discourse around queer students and queer rights in general can have a profound impact on their educations and experiences. And it's particularly salient for us to think about this, as recent data has shown that 11% of high schoolers identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and 2% identify as transgender. And you can't just add these numbers together because there is some overlap here. And recent reports and research by the HRC has shown some troubling findings about the experience in high school, with only 27% of students saying that they can be themselves in school and in the classroom. 70% report bullying. At the time before the Supreme Court ruling, 51% of trans youth said they can't use bathroom associated with their gender at school. And also, it's important to remember that bullying just doesn't happen at school. It also happens at home, with about 67% of LGBT youth hearing negative comments about LGBT people at home, and the rates were a bit more frequent for people of color. And this background and understanding of queer history and the advocacy that we have done has led me to thinking about queer issues in STEM and how we can think about furthering our equality in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And for this, I applied for the ARC Fellowship in order to do a critical literature review. And I started the critical literature review on queer issues in STEM education by identifying all the literature in about the last decade or so, with the first piece really originating in 2009, with the first quantitative article being followed up in 2014, with a few other qualitative articles released at that time. And again, I searched between about 2009 and 2021. Overall in my search, including support from an awesome graduate student in my group, Madison Swartz, future Dr. Madison Swartz, we found about 33 articles that we used overall, 21 of which were focused specifically on LGBT issues in STEM education, and 12 of which we used to support and augment the work on LGBT issues in STEM education that just looked at higher education overall. So now I want to dig into some of these findings and look at some of the specific issues within students, as well as within faculty and professional scientists. Overall, when you look across the board, you can take away three big takeaways, which is the issue of heteronormativity in STEM spaces, which heteronormativity is the assumption that everybody is straight and will follow this pre-described script of marrying someone of the opposite sex, having children, et cetera, in their lives. We also saw a lot of discomfort from non-LGBT people with LGBT people in STEM spaces. And even more concerningly, we saw that a lot of LGBT people had significant and very real concerns about being out about their identities and also their physical and emotional safety. Overall, through the pieces that specifically looked at STEM education, 8 pieces were specifically on students, 13 pieces were on faculty, and 9 were quantitative in nature, with sample sizes from 60 all the way up to 350,000. And when you look at the qualitative pieces, you saw sample sizes from, 2 half a dozen all the way up to dozens of participants. So let's take a quick look at LGBT plus students. One of the biggest themes for the issues in LGBT students was inclusion versus exclusion. Many out STEM students are avoided by not only their peers, but also faculty, which is limiting their ability to network, be able to develop professionally, and also causes an emotional stress of constantly having to cover their identities and trying to pass as being heterosexual, as being cisgendered, etc. And one of the challenges that really reified itself in some of the qualitative work was the issue of overperformance and having to be more of an engineer and more of a scientist, more of a mathematician in order to fit into STEM places and in order to really, cover their queer identities. If you can't take their sexuality seriously, then you can't take the person who is identifying as it seriously. Why would you take the work seriously? A lot of the literature showed that oftentimes students would join LGBT plus STEM groups, such as OSTEM, in order to find community. But one of the challenges for this was that students who had intersecting identities, those that were also people of color, those that might have a different ability, might be first generation from a low income background, had a hard time integrating oftentimes in this community, as there was a policed norm of what you should be to be in these LGBT STEM communities. And when looking at some of the quantitative results, particularly this one by Bryce Hughes, we find that LGBT students, as compared to the heterosexual peers, actually have lower overall retention, looking at the 4-year retention rate by sexual minority status. Yeah, gays are tolerated, as opposed to an environment that is tolerant. Gays are just tolerated. But what we see here is this issue of overperformance. And we see this a lot in gender in gender studies in science as well, that queer people aren't allowed just to be scientists. They have to be the best of the best, right? And oftentimes in women's studies of science, we call this the Marie Curie complex, which is the idea that you have to achieve at the very highest levels to get the same recognition that someone else from the majority group would get for purely just participating. And these challenges were not confined just to the undergraduate experience. They also percolated and came up for faculty as well as professional scientists. And one of the big things that we found throughout all of the literature is this pressure to separate one's professional and personal self. We found that queer people aren't allowed to be both queer and scientists. They have to be queer in certain spaces, and then they have to be scientists in other spaces. And this oftentimes was impacting and changing the behavior of scientists and how they dress and how they acted, how they used pronouns to reference their partners, which essentially led them to live these double lives, but also unfortunately avoid social events. And this was a continued energy that had to be put into passing, just like students. And then also the stress of having to repeatedly come out. People oftentimes think that coming out is a one-time event. For those of us that are queer, and as was demonstrated in the literature, we have to come out over and over again. Every time we have new students, every time we have a new colleague, and you never know how people are going to react. The other challenge that we saw was intersectionality, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. But very concerningly, when we looked at surveys, particularly of people in geosciences, many of the participants responded feeling unsafe in field science, and a third actually reported not going to field locations because safety was an issue for them. In one study, which I did participate in, so I am biased towards, we saw that intersectionality was really key to people's experiences, as when we looked at the level of harassment across men, women, gender non-binary, and trans folks in physics, we saw that based on your identity, it impacted how much LGBT harassment you were experiencing. And again, this just demonstrated the importance of intersectionality and how we can't just look at queer people as just being queer. We also have to look at their gender. We also have to look at their race. We also have to look at what abilities they have. Where did they come from, right? Are they parents? And in a study of 25,000 participants, LGBT scientists were significantly less likely to report having career opportunities, sufficient resources to do their work, or comfort in whistleblowing if they saw issues. And unfortunately, in the same study of scientists by Sech and her colleagues, they also found devaluation, exclusion, and harassment. But one of the challenges of this work, though, was that intersectional analyses really weren't being done. And that's one of the challenges that we saw in the student research, as well as the faculty and professional research. And this made us start thinking about what were the kinds of resources that we could find on LGBT issues in higher education more generally to really fill in these gaps in the literature and to understand what is going on with intersectionality. So we looked at a number of studies to fill in these gaps, to look at issues that people of color face, transgender people face, and other community members, such as people with disabilities. And the research we found showed this concerning cross-section of race and being LGBT. And we found that LGBT people of color were more likely to report harassment in higher education than their people of color transgender peers. And also a stronger expectation of hiding their identity for Black students at HBCUs was also discussed in one study. We also found that transgender experience were quite negative for a lot of people in higher education in general, with intentional use of wrong pronouns happening, and also plenty of physical safety concerns, particularly in the use of bathrooms, which is a very simple everyday to day thing that all of us have to do, and none of us should ever have to be concerned about. In a small qualitative study, there was also a lot of discussion about the issues that people with disabilities face. And the people with disabilities that were also scientists and also LGBT say that they had a further compartmentalization of their identities, where they really had to separate not only their identity as a queer person, but also their identity as a scientist, just like everybody else, but also their identity and experience as being someone who has a disability. And one of the bigger challenges that we found throughout all of this was tokenization, because when you talk about intersectional identities, someone who's a person of color and queer has a disability and is queer, right? They oftentimes are the only ones in their environment, which leads to them being tokenized or being the one that has to speak for their entire group. And throughout all this literature, we can see important trends about issues of passing, having to put energy into issues that aren't career related, and decreased access to networking and professional development opportunities. And one thing to always think about is what can we do as teachers and scientists in order to shift this discourse, but also improve the experiences of students who live at these intersections and also live at the margins of being a queer scientist. And one important thing to do is make space for people to share their pronouns as a signal of inclusivity, but do not require it. The burden of sharing pronouns is very different based on your identity, so never require it, but make an opportunity for people to do so. It's also crucial that in our classrooms, we promote growth mindset and specifically include LGBT plus students. And this can be through simple actions such as talking about LGBT scientists in history, posting safe space signs. When you're doing your inclusion statements, include LGBT people. But one of the big things that we find in our study is, or in the literature, is that it is not enough to have no negative environment. You need to have an active, inclusive, positive environment, which is drawing people in. And in some statistical models, that actually has a stronger impact on retention and outness than actual negative overt experiences. It's also critical that we address any harassment, misgendering, and problematic behavior immediately. And we need to consider intersectional concerns, as I talked about through this whole talk, right? When we see the history of queer rights, we see that it began with intersectionality, but then we saw fracturing, and we saw that there had to be a lot of unneeded conflict in order to get those intersectional concerns back on the forefront of the queer rights movement. And last but not least, and this is kind of an obvious one to us, but avoid gendered language in STEM discussions. Specifically in physics, I have a colleague, Dr. Donnellan, who made the hashtag cables do not have genitals, because in physics, we still unfortunately reference a lot of things in electricity and magnetism as having these very gendered components. Another important thing that we can do as scientists is push our member societies and other organizations to not hold conferences at locations that discriminate against queer people. It's also crucial that we hold leadership accountable for distinguishing themselves from homophobic policies at their own institutions, as a number of institutions across the country still ban same-sex people from being their students and their faculty members. And it's also crucial that we support papers and research projects on LGBT issues, and we organize conference sessions. And I really advocate for allies to do this work. It's not just up to queer people to fight for equality, it's up to all of us. And also one of the critical things that we can do individually is educate yourself, on queer issues in history. And I always like to give resources. And really the two starter books to start that conversation is A Queer History of the United States by Michael Bronski and Queer Theory, Gender Theory by Ricky Wilchins. These are really two amazing books that anybody really can read and are accessible. And moving forward in the research, I thought a lot about what does this mean for the research that we should do in the future? And really there are a few number of takeaways, but the biggest one is avoiding deficits. So still many of the projects that look at queer issues in the sciences look at deficits. So they take non-LGBT people as some sort of normal and then compare LGBT people. And that creates this unfortunate assumption that non-LGBT people are the norm and LGBT people have to work towards being that. And of course, there are reasons that people do this. And one reason is baseline data and to show the pernicious nature of the issue as compared to non-LGBT communities. But the claim that I'm making is we can talk to LGBT people about their lives and understand it from their perspectives and not have to compare them to anybody. We also need to investigate identity as a resource. So one of our colleagues, Dr. Elsa Matthias and Dr. Yoder, have done some amazing work thinking about queer STEM identity. And I think that we can take that work and build on it to think about how that identity is a resource. So not just looking at the negative experiences that people have for being queer, but thinking about how that identity can be built up to be a resource. And we already have some awesome folks that are working on this issue, and we can really take their work and take it forward, which is great. I also want us to think about applications of queer theory to science education research. One thing I didn't talk about with the word queer is it's not only a noun, something we use to describe, it's also a verb. Queering is something that you do. And queer theory is also an entire academic discipline that really can help us think about how we do science education research and can have real ramifications for what we do in our academic labs. And last but not least, I keep saying this, but be intersectional in our analyses and methodology. Think about the other experiences that people have due to their other identities. And I'm really thankful to be able to say too, that I was able to use this fellowship and the research that we did to apply to a National Science Foundation grant. And my research group now has this amazing grant from the National Science Foundation to look at the social networks of non-LGBT women, as well as LGBT professional physicists, in order to understand how they develop and utilize their professional networks so that we can take it back to students to do programming and professional development to help them develop their own. So I'm really excited about that. And also it's a big thank you to the ARC network and the awesome people who gave me a chance to do this work. I've been doing LGBT in STEM work now for almost a decade. And this fellowship was the first time that I ever had any funding to do it. Up until this point in my career, I have always had to do it myself and fund all the work myself out of my own pocket, or just volunteer to do it in whatever job I was in. So I'm just really thankful to the ARC network for taking a chance, allowing me to do this work. And then it became a seed that hopefully will grow into something bigger with this new grant from the National Science Foundation. So big thank you to the ARC network. I also want to thank Dr. Tim Atherton and Dr. Darius Bost, as well as Madison Swartz, who is a graduate student in my group, and all the other amazing people in my group. If you happen to know anybody that wants to do their PhD in physics education research, shoot an email to me. We have an interdisciplinary program, which is pretty cool. We take 1 year of physics courses as well as 1 year of research methodology courses, including going over to our ethnic studies program, which is really, really unique and I think an awesome opportunity for students. And if you'd like to join any of the LGBT communities that I have started building, feel free to reach out to me. We have a list that I'm working on for physics education researchers. We have a physicist, a queer physicist Slack list as well. And for folks that are in the sciences more broadly, you're welcome in the physics space, but also you can look into other organizations such as 500 Queer Scientists, which also does a lot of advocacy and work for queer folks in STEM. So I just want to thank everybody again for listening. I really appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to your questions, comments, or reflections. I will kindly ask that we do stop the recording for the questions so that people feel comfortable asking questions. So thank you, everyone.
Wow, Ramon, this was...
Thank you. And I have just resumed recording for everyone's knowledge and awareness. I am speechless. So, thank you is an absolute understatement. I do want to let our attendees know that Ramon's report is available on our website, and we are adding that link to the chat. You can also find more of Ramon's work and resources that he has curated in the ARC Network's library. We are so incredibly thankful for our attendees who joined us today and who made this time for this incredible conversation and discussion today. And we invite you to join us next month on January 27th when we host Kimberly Scott from Cohort 3 to share her work. Please note that the date has changed from December 16th. If you have already registered, we apologize for any inconvenience this causes, and you do not need to, in fact, register again. The registration link has not changed, and we are also dropping that in the chat. And last but not least, please provide feedback on your experience with today's webinar by completing our survey, which is also linked in the chat. We thank you so much for joining us, not just today, but for our 2021 webinars and other events and programming with WePan. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great rest of 2021 and start of